Being 7 o'clock, we'll call the Marathon County Board of Supervisors to order. We will start with the Pledge of Allegiance, and please remain standing. That will be followed by a moment of reflection. I
pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. We will have the reading of the notice, please.
An educational meeting of the Marathon County Board of Supervisors will be held at the Marathon County Courthouse, Assembly Room 500 Forest Street in the city of Wausau at 7 p.m. on Thursday, January 16th, 2020. And the agenda was duly signed and posted.
Thank you. I would like to request everyone silence their cell phones and any other electronic devices as to not interrupt the meeting. And we will proceed to roll call. I would request that all the supervisors sign in, please. Thank you. We will proceed. And I would like to welcome all of the guests that we have this evening. And would also like to welcome the viewing audience to our educational meeting. And so we will move on to item number 7, 15-minute public comment. And no one had approached me or the clerk and requested to address the board. So we will move on. Item number 8 should be noted, has been pulled and moved to the Tuesday meeting, the Sheriff's Department Life-Saving Awards. So that will be presented on Tuesday. And so we'll go down to item number 9, education presentation and or reports. Item 9A, standing committee chairpersons or designees. We have Vice Chair McEwen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just wanted to update the board on some things that we discussed at Public Safety on January 8th. A couple items. We had discussed reconsideration of changes to support the sports events occurring on county roads. This was postponed at our December meeting. And we discussed it for quite a while at Public Safety, and there was a revision of the original resolution, but after some discussion, it was determined by the committee, Public Safety, that this probably should come back to be referred back to Public Safety because we weren't ready to drop a new resolution. It's on the agenda to vote on Tuesday because it was postponed, but I'm going to be requesting that it be referred back to Public Safety. We also approved a resolution asking the state to provide additional funding to the district attorney's office for additional ADAs. That resolution is in the packet also. And then the last thing, we did get an update from our district attorney on the roles of the district attorney's office for the county initiatives. And she updated us with a lot of programs that are not core programs that Marathon County is doing at this time. She did not have a list of, as far as number of people or the cost of any of these programs. She's going to come back and further discuss that with Public Safety. So, and that was about it for Public Safety. Does anybody have any questions?
Supervisor Gomes.
Craig, I do have a question about addressing. Local officials or the town chairman and that, we got our census maps yesterday, and none of the roads have been changed. Are they going to be able to have something up to date when it is census time? Do you know anything about that?
I know that was discussed at CBC. I'm not sure what the deadline was, but the census was discussed by them. I don't see anybody here from CPC. Kurt, do you know anything about the?
Yeah, when the track was taken, that information is forwarded to the Census Bureau almost a year and a half ago. Initially, they were made clearly aware that Marathon County was going. When I was in DC, I had discussions directly with staff from the Census Bureau and made them aware that Marathon County was going to be an issue because of the readdressing. So they are aware of that, and CPZ has been in contact with them. I don't know. The first notifications are going out in March for the census. The intent of the census is to actually have roughly 55% participate by internet and/or phone. But we understand that we have a broadband issue in Marathon County we'll hear a little more about. But under the Postal Service, they're going to deliver to the old addresses also, that information.
Okay, we just got the boundary maps yesterday.
Sure.
But thank you. You answered the question very well.
Okay, anything else? Supervisor Robinson.
From the Infrastructure Committee's perspective, we also looked at the event policy and had a number of concerns and have shared those with Craig, and he raised those at the Public Safety Committee. But I wanted to alert you to a different discussion that we had relative to phone service in the rural area. And Supervisor Drabek and others have raised concerns over Frontier's lack of support for the existing network. And I know that there are about to be some stories that will be appearing in the media relative to the issue. And the issue is that people are losing phone service during storm events or the aging of the copper wires, and it's resulting in residents not having access to a phone line, and many times these are in areas that don't have adequate cell service. So as a county, we're evaluating as part of the administrator's work plan what our role will be. Jerry Klein and others are working on communication. It is important that we track the events that occur when those lines are down, and we communicate those to the Department of Ag, Trade, and Consumer Protection to make sure that they're there, that they are there and are logged in. But it is a growing concern throughout the county, throughout the state. And we need to be on top of it. We may not have a lot of regulatory authority, but we can hopefully steer some public policy or some responses. We're looking at potentially inviting Frontier and area legislators to a meeting in March to discuss the problem with associated with deregulation and the lack of compelling reason for Frontier and others to invest in it. And we hope to change some of that behavior so that we can protect the public health and safety.
Okay, any other committee chairs or designees want to provide a report to the board? Okay, we will move on to item 9B, and we have with us today Maijur Mua, and she works at the UW Stevens Point, and she also works for Marathon County at the North Central Healthcare Facility. So I would invite her up here to discuss the Hmong history, displacement of the refugee resettlement in Marathon County.
Good evening. I just had to make sure I set my stopwatch so that I stay within the time frame that's been allocated to me, and just to be respectful of your time as well. First, I want to thank Chairman Kurt Gibbs, Interim Administrator Lance Leonard, retired County Administrator Brad Carger, as well as all of you for this opportunity to speak in front of you tonight. It is a privilege and an honor to be amongst all of you and to be able to share what I know about Hmong history and Hmong refugee resettlement in Wisconsin as well as in Marathon County. So what I will begin with is to give you more of a statistical context for understanding the population of the Hmong in the United States, with that, as well as in Marathon County, and then provide you with a historical context to understand the historical experiences of repeated displacement from China to Southeast Asia, as well as diasporically after the end of the covert war, and then conclude with the challenges that were faced as the Hmong population expanded, and current opportunities that we may all have and want to consider. I know that this is not the clearest visual, but I did take this out of the Marathon County Comprehensive Plan that was published in 2016. This is to give everybody just a demographic perspective on what the population composition was in Marathon County in 2010, according to the U.S. Census Bureau. So you'll see here that 87.4% of the population in 2010 were identified as white, and 5.1% were categorized as Asian. Of the 5.1%, 4.2 of that were people of Hmong descent. And then I also found another visual. I took this from the UW Extension publication titled Hmong in Wisconsin, a Statistical Profile. And this was developed in, I believe, 2013, if I remember that correctly. So according to this map, Marathon County, Milwaukee County had the largest Hmong population within the state of Wisconsin. Marathon County having over 5,600 Hmong residents, and Milwaukee County having close to 11,000 Hmong residents. In Wisconsin in 2010, according to the Hmong National Development Organization, they did an analysis of the census report, and what they presented was that for Wisconsin, there were over 49,000 residents that were of Hmong descent. And for the United States, there were over 260,000 residents in the country that were of Hmong descent. So that's just to kind of give you an idea of what the population looked like in 2010, according to those who actually completed the US Census. So as Chairman Gibbs introduced me as an adjunct faculty at UW-Stevens Point in the history department, as an educator, I believe that education is the pathway for us to create an understanding of who we are as individuals as well as a community. And for me, history is very personal because it really is not just the study of the past, but it is the study and understanding of humanity and the human condition and the events and the experiences that we have experienced or our ancestors have experienced that have led us to where we are today. And so by understanding our past, we're able to understand who we are and be able to look into the future and think about the opportunities and the potential that we could be as a community and as an individual. So when I taught last semester, as well as I would say throughout my childhood up until adulthood, there's been a lot of questions about who are the Hmong, where do they come from, where do they originate from, and I want to begin here just very briefly, provide you with a larger historical context to understand, not to say that the Hmong originated from China, because that is actually very controversial, but according to historians and to scholars who have studied the Hmong and who has done extensive research, there has been clear evidence that points to the Hmong having some origin that's based in China, particularly in the Yellow River region and south of that. How the Hmong got to Southeast Asia was due to wars that occurred in China. They were pushed out by the Han Chinese as well as other groups. The Hmong were also forced to assimilate. They were taxed. And so there were a number of reasons that pushed the Hmong southward to the southern region of China, which is below the Yangtze River, and then into Vietnam, Laos, and Thailand. And that occurred in the 19th century, in which there was a mass migration of Hmong that moved southward from China to Southeast Asia. And I'm going to concentrate a little bit on the secret war in Laos, because that was one of the critical moments and a huge event in not just Hmong history, but refugee history and US history, in which we experienced a huge humanitarian crisis and the displacement of hundreds of thousands of Hmong that really changed the trajectory of not just Hmong history, but Hmong livelihood. And what I have here is a visual of a Hmong Bandao. What I really like about this is it's a simplified narrative of what occurred in Laos and how, and the experiences that the Hmong went through. So first, I'm going to begin with the end of World War II, in that when we talk about the secret war and how the Hmong became involved in serving as allies to the U.S. against the fight to serve as allies for the U.S. against communism, is that it's situated within within the larger context of the Cold War. So at the end of World War II in 1946, the U.S. supported French reoccupation of Vietnam. Up to 1940s, France had been the colonial power and had control over Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. So at the end of World War II, French reoccupied Vietnam, and the U.S. supported the France in their reoccupation of Vietnam. The U.S. saw it as an opportunity to pursue their interest of becoming a global leader of the free world. Their involvement in Vietnam and in Indochina increased as the U.S. began to focus on containing and preventing the spread of communism, as well as Soviet expansionism during the Cold War period. So on May 7th, 1954, the French surrendered. They were attacked by the North Vietnamese Viet Minh troops at Dien Bien Phu. And interestingly, this was also a period where the Hmong was active in supporting the French in Indochina. And as there was news about the battle at Dien Bien Phu, Tu Bi Li Fong, who was actually the leader of the Hmong troops at that time, along with Vang Pao, who was a major at that time, were sent to support the French at Dien Bien Phu. However, when they arrived there, the French had already lost the battle to the North Vietnamese, to the Vietnamese forces. The Vietnamese saw French defeat as the beginning of their independence. Vietnam, however, did not become free. They were divided at the 17th parallel, and that was a result of the conference that occurred in Geneva, in which France, the United States, Great Britain, China, and the Soviet Union negotiated and decided that they would divide Vietnam at the 17th parallel. Also included in those agreements were to cease fire in Vietnam as well as in Laos and Cambodia. That there would be, they also established that there would be no military troops, foreign troops, or military alliances in those three countries. Also, Viet Minh, the North Vietnamese, were to withdraw from Laos completely. However, even though the 1954 Geneva agreements were signed, the US, Soviet Union, and the North Vietnamese eventually violated the 1954 Geneva Accords. The US feared that Laos would fall into communist control due to the instability of what was going on internally in Laos, because there was a struggle for control of the Laotian government among the Royal Lao Army, the Neutralist Army, as well as the Pathet Lao. The US provided financial support to the Royal Lao Army because they wanted a US-friendly anti-communist government that would govern Laos. The Soviet Union provided financial support and supplied the Neutralist Army as well as the Pathet Lao with military support. They were also supported by the North Vietnamese. So even though the 1954 Geneva Accords had said that there should be, that those countries should be neutralized, that did not happen. The Ho Chi Minh Trail became an important battle zone because that was the lifeline of the Pathet Laos as well as the North Vietnamese, in that the North Vietnamese relied on the Ho Chi Minh Trail to be able to transport military supplies, aid, and information back and forth from North to South Vietnam. The trail crossed over into Laos and Cambodia, so it went from North Vietnam into Laos, Cambodia, and then down to South Vietnam. So that's where the Hmong comes in. So as the U.S. is gaining greater interest in Indochina, and as it is vying for a superpower, vying for a global power, because during the Cold War it was ideological warfare against the Soviet Union and the fear that Southeast Asia would fall into communism, would fall into communism if the U.S. did not intervene. In 1959, Bill Lair, who was from Texas, had joined the CIA as an undercover paramilitary officer. He had heard about Vang Pao because of his military involvement during the French occupation of Indochina. And so Lair met with Vang Pao to discuss whether or not he would be interested in supporting Lair's project called Operation Momentum. And the purpose of Operation Momentum was to train and arm 1,000 men who would serve as a special guerrilla unit to support U.S. foreign policy on containment of communism. And Vang Pao agreed to that. Lair's Operation Momentum, was authorized and funded by the CIA. So because of the 1954 Geneva Accords, which stated that no foreign military alliances or troops should be present in Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, this was an avenue for the US CIA to be able to operate covertly through the Hmong and other ethnic minorities that resided within those territories. Beginning in the early 1960s, Hmong soldiers led by General Vang Pao supported the US CIA and Royal Lao government fight against the Pathet Lao and North Vietnamese. However, shortly after that, in 1962, there was another meeting in Geneva, and there, the U.S., as well as Laos and a number of other countries, agreed that Laos should be a neutral country. And so, according to the 1962 Geneva agreements, that established the neutralization of Laos and removal of all foreign forces, with the goal of creating a coalition government within Laos. However, even after those agreements were signed, the North Vietnamese forces continued to support the Pathet Lao in Laos. American personnel remained as the Hmong continued to fight the war on the grounds in Laos while the U.S. provided air support. The U.S. CIA had set up a military headquarters for Vang Pao in the Hmong secret army in Long Cheng. Hmong troops were also stationed along the Ho Chi Minh Trail with the goal of intervening and disabling the North Vietnamese to prevent further movement of information and supplies from north to south and to weaken the forces. The war escalated into the 1960s, early 1970s. Between 1964 to 1973, the Hmong engaged in heavy fighting against the Pathet Lao on behalf of the U.S., and that resulted in mass casualties. Thousands of people lost their lives, were injured, were displaced. Eventually, young boys ranging from the ages of 10 to 14 were recruited to fight in the war. And so if you see Bandao or story cloth in an office, or if you go to the Hmong Museum at the Wassa Center Mall, you will see a huge tapestry of story cloth. And these story cloths tell a story. This one in particular tells you about the military, the secret war that occurred in Laos and the impact that had on families, soldiers, and those who lived in that area, and their escape from Laos to Thailand, and then eventually how they ended up in a refugee camp. So I have some visuals here to share with you. This is a picture that was taken in 1966, and this is a group of white Hmong refugees or displaced people who had created temporary shelter because their homes had been devastated from war and heavy bombing, and so they had to move to a different place for safety. Here's also another picture of internally displaced Hmong as a result of the war. And this was taken in Laos in 1971. Here's another picture, and this shows the U.S. Agency for International Development distributing clothes and supplies to internally displaced Hmong in Laos during the war in 1972. And lastly, another photo of internally displaced Hmong who are being airlifted to another part of Laos that was outside of the war zone and would provide them with greater safety. So the purpose of these images is to share with you that during the war between the U.S. and Laos, with the support of Hmong soldiers, is that displacement did not occur after the war. It happened during the war. The Hmong had to rely on rice airdrops because their homes had been devastated. They also could not practice their traditional culture and traditions, such as shifting cultivation. Their lands were ruined because of all of the bombings and fighting. And so they became dependent on U.S. airdrops of rice and supplies and other types of humanitarian support during the war. On the right-hand side, this is just to kind of give you an idea of where Longcheng is located, which served as the CIA Secret Army General Vang Pao's headquarters. So in 1973, there was a ceasefire and U.S. personnel withdrew from Laos. So from about 1960 to 1973, that was when the Hmong soldiers actively engaged in a war that would help further U.S. policy on containing communism. However, in 1973, the U.S. withdrew, leaving the Hmong. In 1975, the Pathet Lao seized control of the Lao government and established the Lao People's Democratic Republic. They then began a campaign to imprison, re-educate, and exterminate any U.S. allies and royalist officers. During that time, in 1975, there was an air evacuation that occurred at Longcheng when after Laos had fallen to communism, the Hmong military leader, General Vang Pao, as well as other military personnel and families that got lucky and heard about the news, were airlifted out of Laos to Thailand. Those who were left behind and served under the command of Vang Pao and allies to the U.S. and their families had to make the dangerous journey swimming across the Mekong River to Thailand as communists intensified their military actions against the Hmong. So on the left-hand side, you'll see a map there, and the blue line, that's the Mekong River. That's to give you a visual of the division between Laos and Thailand and how thousands of Hmong had to either swim across the river with their children strapped on their backs or finding a Thai fisherman who was willing to transport them across the river. Many made it across the Mekong River. Many did not. The star on that map, shows you where Ban Vinai refugee camp was located. That was the largest refugee camp in Thailand. Upon arrival on the shores of Thailand, the Thai government was pressured by the international community because there was a refugee humanitarian crisis to accept Hmong refugees, as well as other groups that had been affected by the war. And they were asked to serve as a country that offered asylum to those who were escaping persecution and war. And as a result of that, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees worked with the Thai government, and refugee camps were opened throughout the borders of Thailand, Laos, Thailand, and Cambodia. And these camps were United Nations sponsored camps, and they were established to receive and process the refugees. At Ban Vinai refugee camp in 1975, there were 12,000 people who were there as asylees, and then that grew to over 45,000 in 1986. So I feel like I should say more about the Refugee Processing Center. In order to enter a country or in order to enter the United States as a refugee, you have to be politically recognized. You have to be authorized by the US government as someone who falls under the category of a refugee. And so before, I'll use myself as an example, before my family could come here as refugees, we had to have a sponsor or a family member in the United States who had to apply and apply for our resettlement. And so once there was a sponsor and the family or an individual has been established as a refugee, someone who is escaping war or persecution and cannot return to their country, otherwise they may face death or other punishment. Once that authorization is given, the refugees had to go to a processing center, which was separate from the refugee camp, and go through a 6-month education orientation to American life and culture before coming to the US. So it was actually a very extensive process, and many people lived in the refugee camps for years. Some of them had children in those refugee camps, and those camps became home for many of them because that was the only place that they knew. As a result of the secret war and Hmong participation in the war in support of US foreign policy and interests in Southeast Asia and internationally, in the refugee camps, people were given the option to either stay in the camp, return to Laos if they felt that if they returned, they would be safe, or they could resettle to a third country like the United States, Canada, other countries. Some of them decided to stay until the camps closed in the 1980s, 1990s, even 2000, 2004. Others made the decision to resettle in a third country. And the United States was one of those countries that accepted refugees because of our involvement in Laos. However, some chose to go to Canada. Others went to French Guiana, Argentina, Germany, France. There were also Hmong who went to Australia. Others decided to resettle in China. There were some who went back to Laos. And so this was the secret war served as I had mentioned earlier, a critical moment in Hmong history, as well as I would say American history, in that when the Hmong was displaced from China to Southeast Asia, they were still on the continent of Asia. But after the secret war, the Hmong was spread globally, and that presented great challenges for the Hmong in terms of how how do they maintain their Hmong ethnic identity? How do they maintain their traditions, their culture? How do they recreate a community across boundaries, across oceans? And there were ways that the Hmong became creative in how they communicated with each other, whether it was through video cassettes or through writing, through poetry, and other forms of communication. But I won't go into that tonight. So with refugee resettlement, what did happen in the US is that the United States government passed the 1975 Indochina Migration Refugee Assistance Act. And that authorized funding and admission of refugees for 2 years. What the US recognized was that there needed to be a more systematic and equitable process for admitting refugees. And there also needed to be more financial support and investment in making sure that once the refugees arrived here, that there was a way to help them transition into American society. And so in 1980, the US government passed the Refugee Act. And the intent of the 1980 Refugee Act was to provide more equity in the admission of refugees in response to the growing humanitarian crisis that was occurring in Southeast Asia as well as internationally. It set a quota of 50,000 refugees per year. And so after 1980, we began to see an increase in Hmong refugees resettling in the US, as well as those who came earlier in the mid-1970s, they were able to sponsor their family members over to the US. So as more Hmong refugees resettled in the US, and more specifically Marathon County, in the 1990s, there was tension around how do we support an increasing population of refugees that have really high needs. And Wausau experienced that around education. In the early 1990s, it was the question of, we have schools in the Wausau area that were densely populated with Hmong children. And how do we ensure that the Hmong children are receiving an education that would help support them in assimilating as well as becoming productive citizens, but also how do we ensure that there's interaction between Hmong students and white students. And there were those who did not agree with busing in terms of busing and integrating schools to make sure that there weren't certain schools that had too many Hmong students. And then there were those who were for it, and there were those who were against it. So that was one of the issues that arose in the 1990s. There were also issues related to poverty and mental health and a number of other things. So where are we now? The first Hmong refugee family arrived in Marathon County in 1976. The early resettlements of refugees occurred as a result of church sponsorship, and then eventually became Hmong families that sponsored their own family members. Some of the challenges that occurred and are still prevalent and opportunities for us to consider is that how do we ensure that there is equity and access to services and to opportunities related to education, related to jobs, related to healthcare, mental health care services. And I don't feel that we have enough data to help us to do a deep dive and to be able to do a close analysis of what the gaps are, as well as what areas are we doing really well in terms of making sure that everybody, regardless of race, background, sexual orientation, religious beliefs, have access to services. And I say that because after providing you with some historical context to understand why we have such a large Hmong population in Marathon County and across the country, is that when we think about differences, when we think about Hmong history, I hope that we will also think about that as what do we have in common with each other, and how is Hmong history also part of American history? My dad fought in the Secret War. He was a captain of his troop, served as an ally to the U.S. Upon resettlement in the U.S., he experienced post-traumatic stress. He was never diagnosed with PTSD, and he doesn't speak very good English. And so during the war, he lost his brother. He had to bury his brother. And so because of that, even to this day, he can't attend a funeral unless if he has to. And if he does attend a funeral, he'll come home and he'll get really ill for a couple of days. And so as we think about our neighbors, as we think about the different histories that we bring to this community, is also to think about historical trauma. Are we serving everybody? When we have new American residents, are we thinking about their origin and where they come from, and how do we ensure that they are connected with the correct services and the appropriate services so that they can contribute productively to our community and to further our mission of creating the healthiest, safest, and most prosperous county in Wisconsin. So I hope that I provided you with some information to take with you and to think about what we all could do together, not just knowledge-wise, but how can we look at our community a little bit differently and move forward together as a community. So thank you so much for your time, and I will take any questions that you have or comments that you may have.
Okay, questions, and a great presentation. I guess I have one question, Major. How do we look, understanding the challenges and the opportunities, how do we start to fill that gap of that data that we need to do a deeper dive?
Yeah, so I think that we have we have surveys that have been established, such as the Life Report. Okay. We have the census that's coming up. And I think that if we were to look at our existing surveys, we could look to see how can we create these surveys or redo these surveys to capture not just the diversity that exists, but who has access to what, who's falling through the cracks. And sometimes that may require asking for demographic information. Not as optional, but really encouraging people to fill those boxes, that I am Asian, or I'm African American, I'm Latino, Latinx, I'm white, and in the past year, I went to see a doctor. In the past year, I earned $54,000, and you're able to break it down and really be able to do a deep dive and analyze the data more closely to see who's falling through the cracks and what can we do as a community to ensure that everybody has equitable and equal access to the opportunities and services that exist within this resource-rich community.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, we'll start with Supervisor Mask.
Thank you. About 40 years ago, I met the first refugees. One of them took him years to find his family because they were scattered all over. The second one was a doctor here, and the last thing he remembered is running to a helicopter, and they couldn't even stop to pick up his child's shoe that fell on the ground because they would have been shot. But what shocked me was about 10 or 11 years ago, I was in a diversity circle, and I met a young lady. She was 16 years old, and her family had recently arrived from a camp. And I was just stunned that there were still people coming from camps, refugee
Yes.
camps. And so are there still people in refugee camps that are still coming here from these camps?
The last refugee camp for Hmong specifically was Wat Tam Krabok. I don't know how to say that with an English pronunciation, but so the Wat Tam Krabok served as a refuge for Hmong refugees from, I believe, the 1990s until 2004 when it closed. And as a result of the closure of that refugee camp, Marathon County did serve as one of the reception sites where we resettled between 400 to 500 Hmong refugees from that area. That's the, I would say, latest group of refugees of Hmong descent.
Thank you.
Supervisor Rosenberg.
I just want to say thank you very much, Major, for this presentation. It's very informative. And Chairman Gibbs asked my question about the data gaps. That's something I'm really interested in. I mean, obviously, if we don't have the data, we can't create the policies that help create a more equitable county. So I think we have some things to think about. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Okay, Supervisor Lowe.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Major, for the presentation. I also studied history, and I studied the Vietnam War extensively as a history major at UWSP, so this brought back a lot of like papers that I wrote and stuff like that. Thank you. One of the things that I wanted to say too is like not a lot of people know that during the Vietnam War, there were Hmong pilots. So it wasn't just guerrilla units on the ground. The Hmong also flew combat aircraft. And they trained in Thailand with Thai pilots for that. And so Lee Lu, he's actually a very famous Hmong pilot, and he actually died in action. He was shot down from the sky. So he was given he was one of General Vang Pao's most trusted advisors also, and he was given a huge funeral, which is very important in our culture. But I wanted to talk about refugees because I'm on the EEED committee, and the Historical Society, their programming, they do some programming on Hmong culture, Hmong refugees, and how our people came over from Southeast Asia here. I sent them an email saying that, you know, they should maybe put some programming in their, in what they're teaching to teach the difference between what an immigrant and what a refugee is. Do you think that that would be helpful for the Historical Society? Because they teach a lot of our communities. And so do you think that would be something that they could pursue that would be really helpful with helping the community understand, you know, the immigrant community as a whole?
Yeah, absolutely. There is a distinct difference between an immigrant and a refugee, right? An immigrant, somebody who moves to another country willingly. They have the time to pack up and decide where they want to go. There's choice there. As a refugee, you have to fall under the category of refugee, whether it's defined by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugee, UNHCR, and that refugee is someone who is fleeing persecution, fleeing war, and they fear for their safety. And the U.S. also, in 1980, with the establishment of the Refugee Act, they made sure to redefine refugee to be consistent with the United Nations definition of refugees. So in order for somebody to come to the U.S. a refugee, they have to be recognized and authorized as such so that upon arrival, they're able to receive certain types of assistance to help them acclimate and transition into the United States community, as well as to have the tools to be able to move from trauma into being able to live a normal, productive life.
And thank you. And so to one of the things that I want to add to Chair Gibbs' question about deeper dive into statistics is I know that Portage County, they've established a census task force because the census is coming up in 2020 this year. And so maybe that's something that we could do is create a census task force, making sure that everyone is counted in the census so that we don't lose any county funding from the state and the federal government.
Yes, and just a response to that, there is a complete count committee in the county already, and it is already meeting and trying to identify where there is difficult communities to count, and working on trying to identify how we can assist in getting those accurate counts and full counts. So, Supervisor Schaefer. Try again. I thought I heard it on.
I'll talk loud.
Wait a minute, that doesn't go out to the.
How's this?
There you go.
Okay, thank you for the program. But, you know, whenever we talk about the secret war, I flew into Long Plabong and Plain of Jars 15 to 20 times. I was stationed out of Udorn. We always talk about the secret war, but we never talk about the civil war in Laos that was going on for quite a while between the two brothers, where one was pro-West, one was pro-communist. That's where the problems really started. The Pathet Lao were the pro-communists, belonged to that brother, the prince. And the Laotian army was the one that was sticking up for the pro-West. But we never hear about the two brothers and the fights they had between the Laotian people. You know, the Hmong was a small part of Laos. And I don't know, the Pathet Lao, when we were flying in and out of there, the Hmong were fighting the Pathet Lao, not so much the Vietnamese then, this is 68, but mostly the Pathet Lao, which were Laotians. But we never, all the presentations on the Hmong heritage and all that, they never talk about Laotians fighting, very similar to our Civil War. So, and the Hmong were a small fraction of that total Laotian population. And, you know, they did fight for us, so. But we never really hear, as the United States, we never hear about the brothers in the Civil War, so.
Yeah, just to comment, and I completely agree with you, and that's what historians have presented, is that there was a civil war that was going on in Laos between two half-brothers. One was with the Pathet Lao Party, and then the other was with the Royal Lao Party, and they were vying for control over Laos. The secret war, the covert operation, occurred within that context. It was not completely separate, but it occurred during that period, in that the U.S. was interested in containing communism, and they were afraid that Laos was going to fall into the control of the communists, because China was next to Laos. Vietnam was, there was a heavy military action that occurred in Vietnam between the North Vietnamese and South Vietnamese. But outside of that local context, internationally, the U.S. had, they had an interest and they became involved. And because of the Geneva Agreements that were established in 1954 and 1962, the U.S. had to find a way to continue its policy against communism and to prevent the expansion of Soviet influence internationally. And so in order for the U.S. to to compete against the Soviet Union and to ensure that it rose to the top as a global superpower, it needed to bypass the Geneva Agreements. And by bypassing that, they created covert operations within Laos, within Cambodia, and Vietnam, so that there were people on the grounds that were fighting a proxy war on behalf of the U.S., while at the same time there was a civil war going on in Laos, and the U.S. saw that as an opportunity for them to hopefully influence the Royal Lao Party to ally with them and to create a Lao government that would be friendly to the U.S. and that would be anti-communist.
Supervisor Krause.
Thank you, Board Chair. Thank you for your presentation. I've lived in Wausau, the city of Wausau, ever since I moved back here from Ohio in '94. And while living in Wausau, the city of Wausau, I've always had neighbors that were Hmong, not just one house of Hmong, but many. And I can say that I have not really socialized or gotten to know them very well. And my question to you is, you're talking about data and information. How much integration is there with the people in this area in regards to dating, marriage, children, interracial integration of a social life and family life?
In terms of data, I'm not aware of there being any existing data that we could really look at to see where we were in the 1980s, 1990s as Marathon County and comparing that to our present day community and the integration that has occurred. What I find interesting is if someone was, let's say, a sociologist or an educational anthropologist, if they had done a longitudinal study and they had sat in the cafeteria at Wausau West in 1990 and continued to sit in that cafeteria to today, they may see a difference because the cafeteria was very segregated. At least when I was in high school, the Hmong kids were on one side, the white kids were on another side of the cafeteria. And so is that still occurring? I don't know. And if it is still occurring, at what level are we actually integrating? And what does that look like? So I don't have an answer, but I think that's an opportunity for us to think about how might we do our local surveys differently to get that narrative, to get that statistical perspective on where our community is presently, and then to also look at access to opportunities and services.
Thank you.
Okay, we have Supervisor Seiler.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for being here tonight and providing a really wonderful context. I really appreciate that. As you were sharing, in particular, the trauma that your father experienced, and it struck me, and you really made a good point that everyone has a story. And so I have a question for you. Just recently, I've been hearing more use of a term, trauma-informed care, in particular, because of my role serving on the Aging, Disability, and Resource Board. And I imagine in your role at North Central Healthcare, you're very familiar with this, even though for me it's a new term. I'm not sure how long it's been out there. But could you share with us, because what I did a little research on it, and I'm thinking that certainly with so many discussions in this boardroom and looking at our residents, having that framework to look at situations and everyone's story could be very helpful. So could you share your definition of that and how you see that as a framework for not only your ancestor, not ancestors, but your community as well as everyone here in Marathon County. I'd appreciate your insight on that.
Sure, absolutely.
Thank
So I want to begin by saying that I have been in my role at North Central Healthcare for maybe about 2 months. So I'm still learning a lot. However, the work is so humbling, and I approach my work not just professionally, but personally because of my dad and his experience of post-traumatic stress. But my understanding of trauma-informed care is that when you're working with people, with patients or clients or consumers, that you're asking them what happened to them, and starting there instead of labeling them or assuming that you understand their story or that you understand what they need, but really meeting them halfway and allowing them the space and the opportunity to share their story with you before you even jump to a conclusion or making a judgment about what their needs might be. And what I shared with my students last semester, because I had a couple of students who were majoring in social work, and what I pushed them to think about was that when we approach care from a perspective that we see them as different from us, whether racially, culturally, religiously, that is already a barrier. That is already prohibiting us from being able to see them as a human being and to be able to really connect with them and to provide them with the best care that they need and the most appropriate care that they need. And so by recognizing that if you are working with, let's say, my dad, who is Hmong and speaks limited English, that you would recognize, okay, I am approaching my patient and I am approaching him through the lens of difference. I am seeing him as different because he is Hmong, because he is Asian, and I am different from him. If we can get past that stage and recognize that and then have the conversation of what happened to you, share with me your story. And then he might tell you, I was a captain during the Secret War. I lost my brother. I had to bury him. I can't attend any funerals, otherwise I'll get really ill. I wake up with cold sweat, so on and so forth. And then once you get that story, you're not seeing him as a Hmong patient, but you're seeing him as a human being who needs your support and your guidance. And that's my understanding of trauma-informed care, is seeing people for who they are, listening to what their needs are, and working together to achieve their goals as well as my goals as a provider or a caretaker.
Well, thank you, and thank you, Majer Moa, for a great presentation and great education, and thank you for all of that information that you provided, and hopefully we can work together in trying to fulfill some of those gaps in the information and look at the challenges and opportunities to move forward.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. So next we have item 9C, broadband for Marathon County, broadband assessment and plan. And I would invite to the podium the the interim administrator, Lance Leonard, to introduce the individuals that will be presenting on the broadband study.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Today we have Jack Madom from Design 9 to discuss with you the Marathon County Broadband Assessment and Plan that all of you have received and reviewed. I just want to give you a real quick bit of context so that you understand the nature of the presentation and what's going to be asked of you in the future. Certainly broadband has been a topic you've discussed a lot in the last term. It was identified by the board in 2018 as it's one of the core elements of your 2018 to 2022 strategic plan. But really broadband has been a topic you've talked about at this body for a great many years, beginning as referenced in the plan in 2009 with the broadband study. You also had a task force, connectivity task force, that met in 2015 and 2016. This report, this plan, is the culmination of that work as well as the work of the Extension Education Economic Development Committee, where it began to discuss what the deliverables of this study would actually be. That group then turned those deliverables over to a work group made up of Chair Gibbs, Infrastructure Committee Chairman Robinson, Extension and Economic Development Committee Chair Guild, and then from the staff side, we had Melinda Osterberg, Jerry Klein, and myself. We took that information and crafted the request for proposals, ultimately selected a vendor, Design 9, and then really the next step is going to be, after this plan is received by the board and considered by the Infrastructure Committee at its next meeting, really trying to answer that ultimate question that we've struggled with since 2009, which is, what is the role of the county in the expansion of broadband service across the county for its residents? So with that bit of context, and again, after the Infrastructure Committee wrestles with that question, it's ultimately going to come back to this full board. But with that context, I'd invite up Jack Madom from Design 9, and he'll answer any questions you may have about the study and the plan.
Thank you, Lance. That helped me quite a bit. I'm all set to go now, so if you have any questions. As Lance said, I've been working fairly closely with Melinda Osterberg, Jerry Klein, and others, John. And this started for our firm, Design 9, back in July. We came here, and over a few days, Melinda had organized a number of meetings. We met with dozens of business leaders, residents, government officials, public safety. And not only that, but we were also charged with reviewing the 2009 gap analysis plan, which we did, which we thought was very useful, very thoughtful, did an important survey. And in fact, the only fault I would find with it is that it declared that every resident in Marathon County should have at least 768 kilobits of broadband service, not even a megabit. So that would hardly do us very well today, because we know that what's happened since then, 2009, that's not that long ago, just over 10 years. The iPhone wasn't invented until 2007. We know what's happened since then. And we also have a pretty good idea of what's coming down the pike as far as broadband requirements. As Lance said, we would recommend that the county or an entity created by the county to manage a network invest in some core components of broadband. This would include towers for wireless access. It would also include fiber optic cable and ancillary equipment connected to that to distribute a high-speed, high-capacity broadband network. The aim would be to provide at least 25 megabits download speed, 3 megabits upload speed, which is the Wisconsin standard. It may also be the federal standard. We're not quite sure. It used to be that, but then it went down to 10, and now it looks like it's back up to 25. But it really doesn't matter because, well, if you have DSL, digital subscriber line, and you're getting 1 or 2 megabits on a rainy day, then 25 megabits seems like a very good service indeed. So it's certainly a good place to start, and the goal would be then to provide that service to virtually everybody in Marathon County who wants it. On the other side of the coin, we have those businesses and other entities, hospitals, schools, et cetera, that are looking for much higher speed. So we need to design a network that would include those who need at least a gigabit of service, 1,000 megabits. And we've done that many times. We've done over 200 studies around the country, mostly in rural areas. I've worked on about 25 of them. And we've seen a lot of similarities. And we think that we have come up with a pretty good plan for Marathon County. And I'll provide some highlights on that. As Lance said, you all have the executive summary, summarizes a 148-page report. And we also have a very detailed pro forma financial plan, which describes in excruciating detail how much it would cost to do this work and how much you would expect to get in return in revenue because people are used to paying for their broadband services. And in fact, I really don't plan to use much in the way of visual aids because the report, I think, speaks for itself. But one thing, there is one chart in there that I think should all point your attention to, and it is in the summary. Actually, no, that one isn't in the summary. That's in the plan, so you have to go through a few pages in the plan to see it. But the point is that in Marathon County, we've estimated, because we did an analysis of the existing broadband providers and what sorts of services they're providing to residents. We did it by zip code. We covered DSL, we covered cable, we covered wireless, covered telephone service and cell phone service. And what we estimate is that based on what services people are now taking and what they're paying for it, that over the next 20 years, there'll be $3 billion spent by Marathon residents on broadband. So if we can get a very small percentage of that money that's already being spent, then we can build a first-class 21st century network here. The question is, how do we get it started? We also address that in detail in the plan. We recommend a number of managing entities or forms such as co-ops, nonprofits, utility departments, private-public partnerships, all of which could be used and have been used in other areas to provide better broadband services. Here in the Midwest, co-ops are very popular, primarily for electrical services, but also there are a number of telecom co-ops that offer nothing but telephone and telecom services. And we know that a number of communities either have or are considering forming such co-ops to offer the services. That has a particular advantage because if a co-op is formed, there are subscription fees that are charged, and this gives the co-op capital to get the network started until the subscriber fees can kick in and pay for the service. We also would recommend that this be an open access network. This meaning that the actual telecom infrastructure, the ductwork, the conduits, the fiber, the towers, are divorced from the service that's provided on those infrastructure elements. So the county or it's the entity that it creates to offer these services, the services themselves will be offered by the private enterprise. So there would be telecom, possibly cable, certainly wireless internet service providers that would lease space on towers or on fiber strands in order to offer their services to residents. So that way, the county's managing entity, can collect fees from the internet service providers who lease circuits and towers, and also collect subscriber fees, a monthly fee. We estimate probably $45 a month that a user would pay to connect to the network, and then they would choose, we hope, from several different internet service providers to determine which type of internet service they would want. Do they want a low-speed, inexpensive service? Do they want a higher speed, more reliable service? And all sorts of other options that are becoming available, such as telemedicine, that could be offered over the network. So there are a number of options, and we've outlined, as I said, in detail, how much they would cost and how much revenue you would get from it. We also expect that this is, as I said, an infrastructure project. It's a long-term project. We estimate 5 to 10 years to provide decent service or to extend the service out to a broad portion of the county. And our pro forma is for a 10-year plan. We also have provided a phased approach. We have 6 different areas, 6 different phases that could be chosen where to start. And that, of course, is up to you as to where you think you're going to get the most bang for the buck and you're going to provide the best service to residents in different parts of the county. So 6 different areas. Because this is a rural area, wireless would be a big component in this, we estimate, after doing propagation studies and analyzing what towers and other what we call vertical infrastructure is available, that we're probably going to need about 32 towers throughout the county to cover, we estimate, about 90% of the population. We were also asked at the initial review of the plan how much it would cost or what additional requirements would be to get 100% coverage. We estimate that would take approximately 10 additional towers. And the towers, we estimate, will cost $118,000 for a basic tower. If we put in contingencies, figure $184,000 per tower. So we're talking about an additional $6 million to cover 100%, in addition to the 32 towers that we recommend. As part of our meetings in July, we met with service providers. We invited all of them to attend. In typical pattern, it was generally the smaller providers who chose to participate, or at least to show interest in the plan. So we've talked to a number of wireless internet service providers. These are people who access towers and put their radio equipment on the towers, and then they sell wireless service to local residents who are within the range of that service, usually within 4 or 5 miles, depending upon the topography, sometimes more, sometimes less. We also had Serenity and other telephone providers, company providers, historically telephone providers. It's mostly broadband now. But they're very interested. They're interested in what infrastructure we would invest in. And as I said, we proposed a core infrastructure. They would like to know the details about that so that they can plan their business accordingly. They did share their current plans with us, and they may change depending upon what the county decides to do. But they're more than willing to partner with the county or with whatever management entity the county creates to offer the service. Any questions so far? I actually do have a couple of visual aids here, which I'm going to just distribute so you can take a look at. This is a 140-strand fiber cable that would go into a ductwork, either underneath on the streets or up on telephone poles. This used to be state-of-the-art. Standard now is 288 strands. We're actually putting in some high-density cable in small town in North Carolina, Highlands, North Carolina, 864 strands, because some large users have demanded that they want to have access to a particular fiber. So as the fiber is in the core, they will have direct access to that, and they'll get better service, and the county could charge more money for that. So I'll pass that around to you. This is typically what would go into a home or residence. This is a strand, 2 strands in there, one going out, one coming in. It's red and blue. I don't think it has any political significance, but discreet. And this is an example of conduit. Most conduit, I'm sure you've seen, is usually either 2-inch or 4-inch diameter PVC pipe. Probably have it in plumbing in your home. That goes when you dig a trench, when you're doing road work. This is another example. This would go in a slit trench, usually about a 1/2 inch wide, goes down about 6 or 12 inches. And then you see it's got the holes in here. You just simply blow the fiber in. Don't even have to put the fiber in if you put this in. So the piece of advice I would give you if I fall down dead here is that if you're doing any road work in the county, be sure you have some conduit in it. Don't even have to put fiber in it. You can always put that in later. This fiber, 288 strand fiber, goes for $1.65 a foot. So over the course of building a roadway, it's fractions of a penny on the dollar. So that would be gold in the ground if you did that.
Okay, questions up till this point? You educated them to the nth degree.
Well, I have a couple of other points. Everybody always asks about funding, so let me get us into that.
Absolutely, absolutely.
I did give you some pricing on the cost of the towers. Now, keep in mind that it's the wireless internet service provider who would actually put the radio gear on the towers. They would pay the county to lease those towers. It might be something like $200 a month. So you make your money back over a number of years. This, again, is long-term. All of these assets would have a life of at least 30 years. The fiber that's been put in the ground in the 1970s is still operating. Certainly, some of the electronics have to be changed out. They become obsolete much quicker. But again, as far as the wireless network is concerned, that would be the burden of the internet service provider. We recommend that this is what's called a lit network. In other words, when you put the fiber in the ground, you don't necessarily, in fact, almost never use all the strands right away, especially if you're putting in some high-density fiber. So it's possible that somebody like Comcast or AT&T would come along and say, you've got fiber in the ground, we'd like to lease some strands on that and offer our own services, either to residents or possibly to wireless cell towers they might be putting up in the area. In fact, the other thing that we're often asked is, well, we're going to wait for 5G or we're going to wait for Elon Musk's Starlink satellite, low Earth orbit satellite system. Verizon, who really got the ball rolling in the 5G area and has hooked up about 30 cities now to some extent, very small extent, they're guaranteeing Corning, which makes the fiber, over $1 billion a year, because now that they've got all of these 5G antennas strewn around, they collect a lot of data, and they need to be able to get that data out onto the internet, and the only way to do that effectively is with fiber. So we don't see any way that there's any other technology that's going to come along that's going to offer better speed, better durability, long life than fiber. The same thing for towers. You put a tower up, the equipment might change every 5 or 10 years, but the tower is going to be good for 30, 40, or 50 years. So we think we're pretty good at determining what's going to be coming along. And in fact, if new technologies do come along, they can generally be integrated into the system. So we think that's important as well. But as far as the funding is concerned, there are grants that are available. So this plan really is a first step in showing that you're serious about doing something about the broadband shortage in Marathon County. A lot of grants are available from the federal government, at least on paper. If you apply for a USDA Department of Agriculture grant, you'd probably have an easier time applying to Harvard, and probably as likely a chance of getting a grant as getting in. A lot of that is because the grants are based on whether you're a served, underserved, or unserved community. That's in terms of the broadband availability. And the FCC develops maps, data maps, based on census tracts to determine whether in fact you are served, underserved, or unserved. If you're unserved, then you're more eligible for a grant. In fact, you're only eligible for a grant if you're unserved. And this has become a bit of a scandal because the incumbents have developed ways of making sure that there's at least one subscriber in each census tract that has what's by definition is broadband. So therefore, that census tract is not unserved, even though there may be only one or two people, one or two residences in that area that have it. So while we will certainly urge you to apply for grants, we don't think that grants would be a financially wise way to build and operate the whole network. They could be a great opportunity to get started. In fact, the reason Chattanooga, Tennessee, which is sort of the pioneer in this whole area, developed their community broadband is because the government gave them $150 million and they were an electric city, so they had control of the telephone poles. So there are all sorts of variables regarding that. But what we do know is that whether you decide to fund this initially solely with grants, or if you decide to have bonding be a part of that, or some other funding mechanism, that eventually this network will pay for itself. And if you look at the pro forma, you'll see that after 10 years, you've got over $600,000 cash on hand, and you've got net revenues over expenses of about $1.6 million. So they provide you with all sorts of opportunities, not the least of which is to encourage other businesses to come to Marathon County, because we recognize that this really is an economic development issue. We not only want to have new business come here, but we want existing businesses to feel they can expand here. And we also want our younger children to be able to stay here and not feel they have to move away because they don't have access to broadband. And as we know, that's becoming a much more important factor in where they decide to live. So any other questions?
Supervisor Christensen with one question, and then we
Thank
have
you, Mr. Chair.
additionals.
With all the towers and everything, what would be the grand total? Roughly, ballpark.
Say that again?
With all the towers and in the underground, what would be the grand total? I mean, this is with the Cadillac, with the extra towers and everything.
Well,
Ballpark.
I mentioned earlier that the towers, if you're first of all, there are two types of towers, so I'm glad you asked that question. What I was describing was the larger towers up to 199 feet that would generally go in high spots in the county. And you're lucky here because it's pretty flat. We do a lot of work in West Virginia and other places, and it's a whole different ballgame. But each of those towers would probably have a base cost of $118,000. And there may, of course, there are other factors. It depends on whether the county owns the land, has to buy the land, lease the land, et cetera. Also depends on electrical service and how expensive it is to get that, and we've sort of averaged that out. And we've added a contingency in there, so we figure the total cost is, a good safe figure is about $184,000. So if you say it's $200,000 for a tower, you've got 32 towers that we propose to get 89% of the population, and then another 10 towers to do the rest. Excuse me, let me just
Go ahead.
focus on, you also asked about the underground. First of all, it doesn't have to be underground. It could go on poles. Depends on whether you have access to poles and what good shape they're in. And if you're doing underground, it also depends on whether you can integrate it with an existing road plan that you might have. We've seen a number of communities that have done that very successfully, cut down on the money to do that. But what we estimate, when we did the pilot fiber plan, it was about 1,400, 1,500 homes that we were passing. And we've done the estimate on what percentage of those that we think would subscribe to it, and the estimate we have is about 45%. So actually, no, it's 3,400 homes and businesses that would be passed. We estimate an initial take rate of about 40 to 45%. That means out of 100 people, you get 40 or 45 who would subscribe to it. So that means about 1,500 homes would be connected by the third year after commencing the installation. And the 450 businesses that would be passed, we estimated a lower take rate there, about 25%, just to be conservative on that. So that'd be about 110 businesses that would be connected. And as I indicated, that there would probably be a fairly small connection fee, probably in the area of $300. And then there would be a monthly subscriber fee, probably $45, which is what we've estimated. And then you would buy your internet on top of that. So that might add an additional $10, maybe up to $50 additionally, depending upon the level of service that you took.
Supervisor White.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a couple of questions, actually a lot of them, because I did read it page by page. It's a great page turner, by the way. First, in the pro forma, financial pro forma, it talks about bonding for 20 years for this. And I have in the back of my mind is, considering the advances of technology that's going on, are we going to be paying for something that's a white elephant in 10 years?
Well, we don't think so.
Well, okay, that's the question.
Well, I did mention that briefly. I can go into that in more detail.
I read a lot of it in the report, so thank you. The other question is, TDS is making a big push in the area. Those of us who might be served by TDS probably would get it before this is done. What if I already have TDS? It talks about a pass-by fee that everybody in the county has to pay. So if I already have TDS and it's running as fast as I want, and I'm up to a terabyte of information up and down synchronous, do I still have, as a resident, do I still have to pay the pass-by fee in the $350?
That pass-by fee is simply one example of what some other communities have done.
Okay.
We're not necessarily proposing that for Marathon County.
Right, that's the question. That's the questions that I came to when I read through the report.
Yeah.
And you talked about actually on page 54 of the report, you talk about 60 cell towers, but further in that paragraph, you talk about a total of 4,000 towers. It's like, wow, that's a lot.
I'm not sure what that refers to. There are what we call community towers that would be used. When you have the larger towers, that are up to 199-foot towers, they would be propagating their signal out into the atmosphere. And if we have a community of, say, 50 or 100 reasonably close together, and in order for them not to have an antenna on their house, or perhaps they're in a region where there's a lot of foliage, or maybe they're down in a dip below a hill, then they can have a telephone pole, say a 70-foot pole, which would go up, that would be a community pole. And then there would be fiber going from the pole to the homes, or there could be actually wireless going from the pole to the homes, either of those solutions. I don't know where the 4,000 figure, I have to look at that.
Well,
I don't
I
think that's
have it
our
right
poles.
here. If, Mr. Chairman, if you allow me to.
Go ahead.
In pitch 54, the second paragraph, it says as many as 60 cell sites per square mile may be needed to make 5G widely
Oh,
available.
okay, yes, that's,
In a given area. If, as example, about 50% or 772 square miles of Marathon County is underserved, 4,000 or more cell sites would be needed to provide ubiquitous coverage.
right, yeah, okay. That, 5G is the next generation of wireless. We're all currently using 4G now, and that allows us to access the internet and do email and that sort of thing. 5G is the next generation. It's really built on mostly 4G technology, but it uses different frequencies. And it uses much higher frequencies, which allows it to propagate more data. And because of that, the antennas are very small, about the size, a bread box, whatever a bread box is these days. But the problem with 5G is that the signal only goes maybe 1,000 feet, maybe more, depending upon things like foliage, rain, the oxygen in the air. It all gets absorbed by that signal because it's such high frequency. So I think the reference there in the plan was to the rollout, the national rollout of the 5G system, in that there are going to be so many thousands of antennas required in urban areas and other places because of obstructions, because of the distance. The technology that is used now by wireless internet service providers is based primarily on the 4G technology, which has a much larger radius. So we're talking anywhere up to 10 miles or more, certainly 5 miles, again, depending upon what's in the way. So that can cover a much broader areas. That's where we get the 32 towers for the county. If, for some reason, the county decided, yeah, we're going to go 5G in the rural areas, you're probably talking 4,000 antennas. But again, they're very, very small.
Okay.
But they'd have to be up very high, so you still need the tower. You have a little antenna on it, though.
Mr. Chairman, one
Go-
more. I have others, but I'm going to ask only one more. Throughout your entire report, you talk about the towns and county.
Yeah.
There's no mention of villages and cities.
Yeah.
Why?
I'm not sure. I did meet with quite a few people from the villages in July. And I think it's just a phrase we use, and you're right, we probably ought to be more specific when that's called for.
Some of these communities might be a little sensitive
Yes,
to being
I understand.
excluded from this report.
Right.
I'm just thinking. Thank you. Thank you,
Sure.
Mr. Chairman.
Okay.
Supervisor Lowe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I did not read the whole report. I skimmed through it. So basically what I was looking for is if I go back to my constituents and I'm explaining all of this to them, I kind of have a feeling that most of them are not going to understand it, or they're just going to be like, wow, that's great, but their eyes are going to glaze over and they're all this stuff. It's important to us, but to my constituent, they really don't care about this. And it might be a little bit too late now, so forgive me if it is, but in the case studies that you do here in the report, what I really wanted to see was how much each household would be paying for broadband service if we went ahead and did this. And I'm thinking the constituent is thinking, okay, if the county does go ahead and do this, it can only get better. It's not going to get any worse than what it is now.
Right.
But the individual that's paying that bill, what they really want to know is how much is it going to cost me? Is it going to be more than what I'm paying now, or is it going to be less? Because if it's less, they're going to be like, okay, great, I can get behind this, let's do it, So are there tables where there's like averages of costs for a household, a business?
Yes, it's all.
Oh my God, I
all-
missed it
it's
because
in
I
the
skimmed
report.
through
That's
it.
all right. It's a lot of pages there. We've gone through by zip code, every provider that we know of that offers a service, whether it's wireless or wireline or cell phone. And we've estimated what it costs to subscribe to that service, how many people subscribe to it. And that's where we came up with the estimate for the $3 billion that's going to be spent on broadband over the next 20 years. And if you look at the prices there, I think you'll see, the average amount that was paid, I know I'd seen it here, I think it was like $150 or something in that regard. And that was, in many cases, for as little as telephone service. If you're subscribing to broadband, TV, and phone service, plus the cell service, you may be paying $200 or $300 a month for all of those services. And if you're subscribing just to a cell phone service and you're using that primarily for your data and your internet coverage, then those bills can really skyrocket. What we estimate is that a subscriber to this network would pay a modest construction fee to get hooked up. In other words, to have fiber come into their homes, possibly an antenna if they're a wireless subscriber. And then they would pay $45 as a subscriber fee per month. And then they would buy their internet service. And as I indicated, I think probably somewhere between an additional $10 and an additional $50. So you might be paying somewhere between $60 a month and $100 a month, depending upon the level of your service. If you want only 10 megabits because you just want to use it as a safety factor in case you need to get a hold of somebody, then you would pay very little. In fact, you could arrange the financing so that you could offer that service possibly for free. So if somebody subscribes, they get a minimum internet connectivity. Or you may be doing work from home, you may have some telemedicine requirements, and you may need a gigabit of service. So in that case, you might be paying $100 or more. Businesses, the same option, but the prices would probably be higher because reliability, security, and other concerns may be a little bit more stringent for them. So figure that's $60 to $100 a month probably.
Okay. Well, that's great. I missed it because I skimmed it.
Generally, we find
Yeah.
it considerably less expensive. Again, if you consider that everything is going to the web now, all your file storage, everything's in the cloud, watching streaming media, et cetera. So that pretty much covers all of your requirements.
Okay. And then when in the study, when it came to the question of what is the role of government, and I was reading where it says that we could compete. That was one of the choices, was we could compete directly with private entities.
No, it was meant not to compete with private entities.
Not to compete?
Not to compete with them.
Oh,
The-
okay.
The county would simply invest in the infrastructure necessary for service providers to offer their services over the internet. So private companies, like the wireless service providers, possibly even Comcast or AT&T, instead of building their own network or upgrading, which they haven't done in most cases, they simply buy a couple of strands on the fiber network and they offer their services because most of them are becoming media companies now anyway.
Right. Yeah, that was one of the recommendations, is to not compete.
That's
But,
correct.
Yeah,
Not
but one of the
compete. Yeah.
choices for the role of government was we could choose to compete if
That's
we wanted
correct.
to.
No, Chattanooga
Right.
does.
That was one of the choices.
Yeah.
But then one of the negatives of doing that was there was like litigation that happened.
Yep.
Can you give an example of
Sure.
that?
I'll give you the, example of Louisville, Kentucky, where Louisville had partnered with Google to build a fiber network. AT&T owned all the telephone poles, and it took a 3-year court case for Google and the city to be able to get on those poles. So that was a case where they were sued because they were partnering, even though the city itself wasn't going to be offering the services. Now, in that case, even that would be different from what we're proposing here because Louisville was going to be using Google as the service provider. We're not proposing that the county commit to anybody exclusively as a service provider, that they allow anyone who offers internet services to come on the network and offer their services and compete with the other providers and pay a small fee to the counties. In fact, New York City, just in the past week, issued an RFP for an open access network for New York, and they figure that price is going to be quite high. I forget what the figure is, but
If I may add one thing, we had conversations, that committee that I talked about before, that core work group, one of the difficulties, or I should say limitations within the state of Wisconsin is that we can't do the thing that Jack just referenced that Chattanooga and other places have done. Our state statutes are structured in such a way that we are largely prohibited from becoming a utility provider. So we can do the things that the Design 9 study outlays with being the provider of the infrastructure, kind of providing the vehicle through which the service is delivered, but we are prohibited largely from being a service provider. Just to add that one.
there are about 20 states that have restrictions like that. North Carolina does. In Colorado, a municipality can do it, but they need to have a referendum in order to do it. I think they've had about a dozen so far, and they've all passed with at least 60% of the vote that people want the community to get involved in providing broadband services, or providing at least some way to improve the broadband.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thanks, Lance, for the clarification.
Supervisor Drabek.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Say, I was just wondering, what's the problems with Starlink that you would not be for that? If I kind of gathered that from the way you said
The
it.
problems with what?
With Starlink?
Oh, Starlink. Well, it's Elon Musk for one. I mean, I'm kind of a fan of Elon Musk, but got to admit he's a little erratic, so I don't know that I want to put my broadband fate in his hands. But he has demonstrated in case you don't know, SpaceX is a space company that sends up a lot of rockets, and they've been developing these over the past 10 years or so. And their latest venture is to provide what's called low Earth orbit satellites. And they've launched about 120 of these, maybe 200 by now. And they're going to cruise about 300 miles above Earth, which is much better than what we have now for satellite, because they're 22,000 miles up in a geosynchronous orbit. And, you know, when you push a button on your key, you might get a response back in 5 or 10 seconds. So this would be much more effective than that. But they're proposing putting up about 14,000 satellites. And it may work. It's going to be great, I think, for like oil drilling companies or other people out in the middle of nowhere who have no other access and have a lot of money, because it's probably going to be expensive, because he intends to pay for his whole space program by offering this service. But we're watching that. If it does become available, if for some reason the pricing is reasonable, then we would recommend that. But the plain fact is that because there's so much more data going, you're going to need more fiber. So even if this became a rousing success and it was cheap, if you put fiber in the ground, Elon Musk is probably going to come knocking on your door saying, we'd like to have access to some of those circuits that you have. But that's a good point. 5G, Starlink, low Earth orbit, those are all important considerations. We look at them all the time. And as Albert Einstein said, there's nothing faster than light. And the electronics on a fiber network will change over time as they improve. But as I said, the fiber that's been put in the ground since the 70s is still operating. And in fact, DSL is the telephone's 1980 answer to the internet. And they used the technology they had in the ground for 100 years, and they bonded some circuits together, and they were able to offer, which at that time was miraculous, 5 or 6 megabits. And so they're still flogging that. They're still trying to get as much return out of the existing network as they can, but unfortunately the physics of the basics isn't going to allow that. With fiber, it's practically unlimited. Certainly in the lifetime of everybody in this room, it's going to be useful.
Supervisor Robinson.
I'm just going to take a opportunity to talk about next steps relative to the presentation. This is perhaps step 2. The first step was what happened historically, and to a degree what the Extension Education Economic Development Committee did relative to trying to define what the need is, and recognizing that utilization is going up at 30% a year. We need to be prepared for the future. So we will be sitting down and looking at what the path forward is, and this is a series of recommendations. And when you put it in the context that about 65% of the county is currently served with some sort of high capacity internet. We're proposing to get to 90, and some of us would like to see if we can't push that up a little bit farther to get to as close to 100% as we can. We've got some work to do, and part of that work is reaching out to the other parties, the co-ops and others, to see what their role is. And unfortunately, the legislature has put both a statutory constraint on our ability to own that system, so we can be partner in the delivery system, much like we build roads, but we don't put driveways into businesses. We can put the roads in front of the house and people can connect. Our job will be to try to define what those roads would look like. But we are also required as part of the PSC grant process to partner with others. We can't be the applicant, we can support their role. So it will be very important if we're going to move this ahead to define what our role is, where that role might be, and there might be some areas where we don't go in because the current system is adequate, although there are deserts even in service areas, and there are the utilities and others that are currently provided look at return on investment first, not necessarily a service to the community. So we'll need to look at this. So the Infrastructure Committee has been working closely with the Extension, Education, and Economic Development Committee. We will talk in the future, and we will try to map out how do we go about establishing the relationships, identifying the partners, and moving this process along. But this is an important step in sort of defining what that system might look like, what the opportunities are, what some of the challenges might be, and we look forward to an exciting time ahead.
Okay, any further questions? If not, I want to thank Design 9 for the great study that we have and the great challenges and opportunities moving forward. So thank you.
Thank you.
Next, we have on the agenda item 9D, an agreement for the joint sponsorship of community programs between Langlade, Lincoln, Marathon County. And we have the interim administrator, Lance Leonard, to give a brief presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I will try to be brief. I know you still have a considerable amount of your meeting yet to go. Let me start with, again, just the context of why you're here today. There was no action being that this body is considering this month at your meeting next week. Instead, much like the broadband discussion that you were prompted to last month, I'm here just to tell you that a conversation is coming and we'll be asking you to take some action next month. So with that context, let me hopefully provide you a couple of things. One is background on the joint sponsorship agreement that was referenced by the chair. Second is the process that we've gone through to this point. And third, I'm going to highlight a couple of the key changes that you will see when you review the agreement for joint sponsorship of community programs that ultimately results in the creation, or has resulted in the creation, of North Central Healthcare. So the new document is continuing North Central Healthcare, its creation with Lincoln, Langlade, and Marathon County. So with that background, I'm going to start again. For those of you on the board, in 2016, there was a lot of discussion about that partnership with Lincoln and Langlade counties and the concerns relative to that partnership. And ultimately in 2017, or 2016 rather, the board directed administration to work with those two counties to really address the concerns and ultimately, I guess a way to look at it is reinvest in that partnership and in North Central Healthcare. And what came out of that was that 2017 Tri-County Agreement. And there were two components to that Tri-County Agreement that were different fundamentally from the agreements that had preceded it. And I'll say one of those was the creation of the Retained County Authority Committee. What, from the board's perspective, my interpretation of that was some way to have the counties, Lincoln, Langlade, and Marathon counties, retain some of the core authorities that are permitted under statute for the board to retain and exercise those. So that body was created for that, the exercising of those retained authorities, hence the name, in terms of oversight at North Central Healthcare. The second component was really the fact that the agreement was time limited in nature. The previous agreements really had no time limitation. They were automatically renewed without action. So that agreement was created, and under that agreement, as I said, it was time limited. The retained county authority committee was tasked with bringing a recommendation to each of the three respective counties on whether to extend, revise, or terminate the 5-year tri-county agreement. So I referenced the retained county authority committee. After serving as one of the drafters of that 2017 agreement, I was lucky enough to be appointed by all of you to serve as the one of Marathon County's 2 representatives to the retained county authority committee with Chad Billup. I was elected the chair of that body and have served as the chair since its creation. So again, we were tasked with bringing a recommendation. The RCA was tasked with bringing a recommendation back to the member counties. What should you do? And we were tasked with completing that no later than July of 2020. As we began talking about the task ahead of us at the Retained County Authority Committee, working with Michael Loy and him interfacing well with the North Central Healthcare Board, it struck us as a good idea to bring you a recommendation before July, and in fact, bring it to this body because you're more informed perhaps than a board that would be seated in April, and we would have to undergo that education process in a rather tight timeline. So that's why we're going to be ultimately bringing this to you in February. So with that background, let me talk about the process. Ultimately, the process that we took at the Retained County Authority Committee was very similar to the process that all of you directed us to take in 2016. And that is find a way to improve that tri-county agreement. Take the things that we think worked really well with the Retained County Authority Committee, and there were some, and take the things that the North Central Healthcare Board gave us in terms of feedback that we can improve and incorporate those things into a proposed revised agreement. And at the end, we spent several months having those conversations. Michael, we worked closely again with Michael Loy and interfacing with the North Central Healthcare Board to get their feedback. And we had 2 types of changes I'll categorize as factual changes and then substantive changes. The factual ones are rather simple. We updated the posture of what has happened between 2016 and today. We also added to the agreement the fact that, as you all know, in the last year when North Central Healthcare Board Chair and Supervisor Jeff Zerini explained to you the acquisition of Lincoln County's nursing home, they explained to you the fact that North Central Healthcare is now taking over disability services for Lincoln County, so we incorporated those factual changes. On the substantive side, I think you're going to see, and we'll explain much more in detail in February, there were 3 kind of big picture substantive changes. First is the makeup of the North Central Healthcare Board. Essentially working, getting some feedback from the North Central Board, and it's also been the experience of the RCA. We saw a potential benefit to do a couple of things. One is integrate the RCA into the North Central Healthcare Board. That was a discussion you all had sometime during 2016. That was one of the original contemplations, was whether we should do that or have a wholly distinct Retained County Authority Committee. The new proposal, the revised contract, calls for that Retained County Authority Committee to be integrated within the North Central Healthcare Board, and essentially, with some small modifications, serve as the executive committee. We also, in the new agreement relative to the North Central Healthcare Board, provided much greater explanation on how those board seats are allocated. Historically, it just says within the agreement, Marathon, you get 10, Lincoln, 2, Langlade, 2, without providing much of an explanation or any explanation for when it would be appropriate to reconsider those allocations. We addressed that within the agreement and really tied it to the relative budget contributions or annual contributions from each of the 3 counties. Marathon County, as you would surmise, maintains the vast majority of the seats on that body. We also provided for the appointment of the medical director to the North Central Healthcare Board. In working with Michael, that was identified as really a best practice in the healthcare area, and really helps to allow that medical director to have an integral understanding of the work of the board and vice versa on the board. And finally, in recognition of Marathon County really serving as kind of the largest certainly the largest partner in this partnership. We provided in that contract, in the proposed revisions, that Marathon County is guaranteed to have a representative from Marathon County serve as the chairperson of the North Central Healthcare Board. We put that within the agreement. The second big substantive change we addressed was how legal services are obtained by North Central Healthcare, by the board and by the organization as a whole. For those of you on the board and that have worked closely with North Central Healthcare, you recall that over the last several years, legal service costs have really been one of those issues that caused North Central Healthcare some tightening budgets. Their costs have gone up, and I think in speaking with Michael, I would agree with his assertion that there are occasions where North Central is not seeking legal services that it otherwise would like to have access to based on cost and just availability. So we addressed that, working with Scott and myself as the RCA chair. We did an assessment and prepared a memorandum that we furnished to the Retained County Authority Committee, and it's going to the North Central Board at its next meeting, talking about the opportunity to have those services provided by a corporation counsel, an assistant corporation counsel, essentially having the county take over delivery of legal services. The Retained County Authority Committee voted to approve that, and it was incorporated within the agreement. The last piece that I'll talk about in terms of substantive changes was this idea of providing some framework for Michael as the CEO to start to have discussions if the need arose relative to contracts with outside agencies. As North Central continues to specialize in its core areas of skilled nursing, inpatient psychiatric care, and behavioral counseling, we think it's Michael's insight that it's highly likely that outside agencies, whether they're a governmental agency, another county perhaps, or nonprofits or a private provider, may wish to have North Central provide some services, partner together to provide some services. And we didn't, within that agreement, have any framework to guide the chief executive in having those conversations. So we sought to provide a very, I guess, pared back or bare bones framework. We know there's a lot that we don't know when those conversations are going to happen, but ultimately we nailed down a couple of key pieces. One, certainly it needs to be legally permissible for North Central Healthcare to do it. We called for the generation of a management agreement, separate governance, and ultimately, because we recognize that each of the counties have a financial interest at stake, we called for any such contract really to be beneficial on the bottom line for the members, Lincoln, Langlade, and Marathon County. So that's the Cliff Notes version of what you're going to see when you see the proposed revisions to the new Tri-County Agreement in February. In terms of next steps, I'll be brief. Lincoln County has already, Nancy Bergstrom is their representative on the Retained County Authority Committee. She has already taken the proposed revisions to her home committee. They were approved there. My understanding is they're going to be considered by the full board in January. Langlade County, like Marathon County, the idea is to have that document reviewed by the home committee in Langlade County and ultimately the full board in February. So what that looks like here in Marathon County, the home committee for myself as the chair of the Retained County Authority Committee, I interface with the Health and Human Services Committee. So Health and Human Services meets on the 27th of January. That document will be discussed at that meeting with the understanding that if it is moved forward, recommended approval, it would be before you, all for your educational meeting on the 20th, and ultimately to be voted on February 25th. So my understanding from speaking with Chair Gibbs and Health and Human Services Committee Chair Boots is that we will provide you this document later this week. Again, this is just to prompt you that it's coming. And much like the broadband discussion that you had today, if the hope is that you have the opportunity to generate questions and provide them to Chair Boots and Chair Gibbs so that we make sure we address those in our formal presentation to you in February. The last thing I'll say is the effective date The proposed effective date of the revisions would be May 1st of 2020, and we continue that 5-year tri-county agreement. So I know that was a lot. I tried to be brief because I know you still have a lot of work to do. And if you have those questions, please, after you see the document, reach out to Chair Gibbs and to Chair Boots. That's all I had.
Thank you. Moving on, review and discussion of Tuesday meeting agenda items under 10A1, appointments, Veterans Service Commission.
Reappointing Roger Cito, 3820 North 14th Street, Wausau, to the Veterans Service Commission for a 3-year term to expire December 31st, 2022.
Any discussion? Okay, under appointments, 10A2, Acting Veterans Service Officer.
Appointing Mary Dunn, 127 Miller Avenue, Wausau, to serve as Acting Veterans Service Officer for Marathon County, retroactive to January 13th, 2020.
Supervisor Schaefer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Why are we making her acting? Is she to become the director?
I will turn that over to the interim administrator.
Thank you.
That was getting hard to say.
Yeah, fine. It's late as well. Good question. Our previous veteran service officer, he retired effective the Friday before we're making the retroactive appointment. So under statute, that is one of the positions that the board approves. Veteran service officer is an appointment made by the administrator, confirmed by the board. Historically, when we had a vacancy, and speaking with Scott, the board had previously done the exact same thing. In fact, they had a vacancy based on a retirement. They made a retroactive appointment. So I hope that answers your question.
But it says acting veteran. Is she not to be the veteran service officer?
That's the same language that the board approved. I think it was in 1998. The last
Well,
time.
because Scott acted like a veteran service officer, so I guess this is all right then.
Other Scott, Scott Berger.
Yes.
My understanding of there are other candidates
Yes.
that are, I think that's the answer that that are going to be interviewed and then a determination is going to be made on a permanent. You bet.
Okay, any other discussion? Okay, moving on to ordinances under 10B1, Environmental Resources Committee. 10B1A, Town of Reed rezone, Nathan Winsenson and Richard and Gladys Heisler and Matthew Sherwa. Ordinance 1-20. Any questions? Okay, resolutions from Public Safety Committee. 10C1A, adopt a policy on county support for sports events proposed to occur on Marathon County highways. Resolution 73-19. This was postponed from the December meeting, and as you've heard from the chair of the Public Safety Committee, he is going to request to have that referred back to the committee, and there will be a joint meeting, as I understand it, between infrastructure, which has some concerns, and also public safety that will have a joint meeting and discuss some of those concerns, and when they're ready, bring that forward. Vice Chair McEwen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, but you mentioned everything I was going to, so thank you.
Oh, sorry, I beat you to it. Any discussion? Okay, under resolutions, under 10C1B, support for state funding to hire more prosecutors for Marathon County-based District Attorney's Office, the third draft resolution 1-20. Vice Chair McEwen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I did mention this earlier, but Public Safety did approve a resolution requesting the state to provide funding for additional district attorneys, or ADAs, at Marathon County, and I'm sure we can all remember from our budget discussion, everybody's aware that the district attorney's office is extremely understaffed, and this would be the second resolution that was sent to the state. First one was in 2017. So it's just a follow-up on the needs from the district attorney's office. Thank you.
Supervisor Lowe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just wondering, from what we heard from the DA's office during budget hearings, I was wondering, could we put in this resolution something about mental health care for our prosecutors? Because I feel like that's an area that would need to be covered. Because, you know, from what they were just saying to us, you know, like, I feel like there's some mental health care that needs to be addressed there. I don't know, just.
We'll look into it and we'll provide some feedback on Tuesday.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, any other discussion? Okay, moving on to 10C 2A from Human Resources Finance and Property Committee approved the 2020 budget transfers for Marathon County Department of Appropriations, Resolution 2-20. Does require a 2/3 majority vote. And just a correction, those are 2019 budget transfers and not 2020 budget transfers. Okay, under 10C 2B, an initial resolution authorizing not to exceed $3,215,000 of general obligation promissory notes for Marathon County 2020 Capital Improvement Program. As you remember, the capital improvement program was approved as part of the budget, but part of the funding is coming from capital and bonding, and so this is the initial resolution authorizing to go out and borrow those funds to do those projects that were approved by this board in the budget. Any discussion? This does require 3/4 majority vote of the board. So, and an absence of the board member is a no vote. Any discussion? Okay, item number 10C 2C, a resolution providing for the sale not to exceed $8,500,000 general obligation promissory notes, Series 2020A, Resolution 4-20. Discussion on that. Included in there would be the $3,215,000 for the 2020 capital projects, and then the balance of that borrowing has already been authorized as part of the project for North Central Healthcare, part of that remodel down there. Okay, moving on to item 10C 2D, a resolution declaring official intent to reimburse expenditures for the 2020 Capital Improvement Program, Resolution 5-20. Questions on that resolution? Okay. Item 10C3, Human Resources, Finance and Property Committee, and Marathon County Parks Commission. Item 10C3A, an agreement regarding fees relating to Wausau Area Softball Association use of Sunnyvale Softball Complex for the years prior to 2019. Supervisor Schaefer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And we don't have to do it tonight, but for Tuesday's meeting, can we have a breakdown of how anybody with a department head can let a group get back $200,000 back? Not paying, we can do it Tuesday, but I would like to know how we have department heads which we are paying a very respectable amount of money to, and unfortunately he isn't here now, but we have to have some information on this. And we can do it Tuesday. I don't have a problem
We'll
with
try
that.
to provide you the background and how and where we're at now. Any other discussion on that agenda item? Okay, announcements and/or requests. Supervisor Schaefer.
I'm going to stand now because I was reading the employee newsletters, and I think we have a distinguished gentleman amongst us tonight that's been here for 30 years and 13 days, and I would like him to stand up and take a bow, and that would be our corporation counsel. Wow. Happy anniversary.
Yeah, Supervisor Mask.
Thank you. Partnership for Progressive Agriculture is sponsoring the 88th annual Farm City Dinner on Thursday, March 12th. And this year it's going to be at Stony Creek at Cedar Creek. And it's going to be a little bit different venue this year. There'll be a cash bar starting at 5:30, and we will have food stations beginning at 6 and a revised program. And there will be no assigned seating, so you can mingle with the crowd. It's going to be a little different, and I think it's going to add a little interest. So I invite everyone to come Thursday, March 12th. It's the 88th Farm City Dinner. Thank you.
Okay, Supervisor Krause.
Thank you, Board Chair. I would like to mention that it is the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, and that is passing women's right to vote. And that was done in 1920. And Caddy Stanton Smith was the one who, at Seneca Falls in 1848, convened a convention and talked about women getting the right to vote, having legal rights to the ballot. And it was 75 years later that it became a part of the Constitution. Unfortunately, those women who were called suffragettes, who spoke across the United States, marched, demonstrated, and wrote greatly about women having the legal right to vote. They did not live to see that this amendment, that this was passed, that women could have the right to vote. And as a result of women's right to vote, we have found that women are not subservient or second-class citizens as much as they were in the past. And I'd like to commemorate that this year is a very important year. Many of the states, the colleges, government entities, businesses are putting on programs, classes, entertainment, celebrations, which already started last year, celebrating the 100th anniversary of women's right to vote. And then I'd also like to mention something else. And I just found out a couple days ago, and I had worked on and marched, I actually walked, it wasn't a march, walked in Cleveland, Ohio in the 1970s for the ratification of the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment in Ohio. Buses went to Columbus, and I'm not sure what was going on in Wisconsin at the time. But Virginia is passed the Equal Rights Amendment, the 38th state to do that. We needed 3/4 of the 50 states to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment, and Virginia was the 38th state just a little while ago. So the Equal Rights Amendment the Equal Rights Amendment will become a part of the Constitution soon. Thank you.
Supervisor Rosenberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to point out, I've been wearing this button for the last couple of meetings. It says Live in Joy. It's in honor of somebody in my neighborhood. Her name is Claire. She's 9 years old. She was diagnosed with a rare brain tumor, and she's basically fighting for her life. So I just wanted to give her a shout out. She's at St. Jude's right now, so we got your back, Claire.
Any other announcements and/or requests? If not, we stand in line for item number 12. Supervisor Langenhan with the motion, Supervisor Seubert with the second to adjourn. Any discussion? All those in favor of adjournment signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? We stand adjourned. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.